So I think one of the things that Taoists were very clear about is that warfare, or we might say direct conflict or aggressive action, is never helpful in solving a problem or a situation, because this produces further destabilization. How do we respond to aggression?
So once there was a wise old man. He was known for his balanced and wise nature. This young man from the village who was stressed out with his everyday life came to the old man and said, "Give me some advice, help me out." So the old man gave him a spoon with oil in it, took him to the top of the hill, showed him this tranquil lake and said, "Walk around the lake with the spoon, but don't spill any oil." So the young man came back hours later, very excited that he hadn't spilt any oil. The old man asked him, "Did you notice the sunset? Did you see the birds? Did you see the flowers blooming?" So the young man said, "No, I didn't see any of that." The old man was trying to teach him about Taoism and the art of balance. I'm Anshu Bahanda. This is Wellness Curated, and our new series is Ancient Wisdom for Modern Living. And we have with us a very special guest today. We have Professor James Miller, who teaches at the Duke Kunshan University. He's written 6 books on Taoism, and he's a leading interpreter of the subject. Welcome to the chat, James, and thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great privilege to be here and to talk about Taoism with you.
Thank you. Before I carry on, can I please request you all to subscribe to this channel, because we're trying to get you better and better speakers and not charge you for it. So please do subscribe straight away. Thank you. So back to Taoism and the art of balance. So Taoism, or Taoism, as it's also called, is a philosophical and spiritual tradition out of ancient China. Tell us more about this philosophy and tell us more about Wu Wei, which is, effortless action.
Sure. So I think the underlying principle of Taoism is that life is flourishing in the world today. And when we look all around us, we look at nature especially, we can see life is flourishing. Things are changing. Acorns grow into oak trees. Tadpoles transform into frogs. We can see this abundance of flourishing and change and transformation in the world around us. And this really inspired ancient Chinese philosophers to think, where does this come from? Why is there this effervescence or this abundance of flourishing in the world? And they attributed this to a principle that they called Tao, which it just means a way, right? It just means and we can see it in the transformation of things. And the Tao Te Ching says, we don't really know what this is. We don't have a name for it. We can't call it a god or something like that. We can just see this principle emerging in the flourishing and transformation of things all around us. Do we have to make any effort to allow an acorn to grow into an oak tree? No, we don't have to do anything to make this happen. This happens just effortlessly. It happens from the internal dynamics or the internal drive of the things itself. One of the things that comes from this is that if we pay attention to how things are flourishing in the world, maybe we don't have to put in all of the effort to transform things according to our own will or intention. It's much better to put things in a position where they can grow and flourish of their own accord. And maybe one metaphor for this is you can't just make crops grow by just giving them too much water or pulling them up out of the ground. You have to let things take their own course. And the world is set up to allow things to grow and flourish. And if we're smart about it, we can see how that works, and we can put ourselves in a position where we can benefit from the flow and the transformation that we see in the world around us. And that's Wu Wei. It's a kind of being effective in the world without forcing things to happen in a certain kind of way, or without making too much effort. And this is about being in a balance between yourself and the world around you.
Tell me, how can we use that to change our lives? How can we use the principles of Taoism?
So when the ancient Taoist philosophers looked at the world, they saw that in principle in the world, there's always positive and negative. So for instance, we have summer and winter, we have daylight and nighttime, we have, everything in the world can be divided and we can into these sort of binary pairs. And what they realize is one of these things is not better than the other, right? We need both of these things for the world to exist. And they began to apply this principle more broadly. We can't think about male being better than female or the other way around. We can't think about, in a modern sense, we might say, we can't think about work being better than leisure or the other way around. We need both of these things, and the optimal life comes from when we have these things in balance. And this comes from looking at the world, looking at our lives holistically as a system where things are always in a process of change. We're going through the day, we wake up, we have this period of activity, and then we go into rest in the evening and we start again. And everything is a cycle like this. We can't plot our lives around, let us go in some linear direction to achieve some objective in the future in a single-minded way. We have to allow for the fact that there are these rhythms and harmonies to our life. And if we overlook this, this produces ill health. It puts us out of balance, and this is it's unhealthy. So Taoism is also tied to the principles of Chinese medicine as well, which are also based on having a balance within the body.
So you're talking about Chinese medicine and Taoism, and it reminds me so much of Hindu philosophy and Ayurveda, the fact that they work together, and it's all about harmony and principle and cultivating it internally.
I think so. I think where there's an overlap is that Chinese philosophy has this idea of qi, or a kind of energy that flows in the body. And in Indian philosophy, we have this concept of prana as well. It's a kind of material force or energy in the body. And it's something that's quite absent from kind of Western understandings of the body, where people didn't really pay attention to any kind of experience of the sort of inner life of the body. So there are some differences between both how Indian medicine came to think about the body, but I think some of the underlying principles are definitely the same. So there is energy flowing in the body. It has to be in balance. If it's not in balance, this produces what we in a kind of Western biomedicine sense would call diseases, right, or symptoms of diseases. Yeah.
I know that the Taoists had a very special way of tackling conflict. Can you tell us about that? How can we apply it to today?
So obviously, Taoists living 2,500 years ago didn't live in the same world that we do today, but perhaps it is possible to think about how we can apply some of their thinking to our world today. And in the early China was a very unstable place full of warfare. So I think one of the things that Taoists were very clear about is that warfare, or we might say direct conflict or aggressive action, is never helpful in solving a problem or a situation, because this produces further destabilization. And so Taoists began to think about, well, how do we respond to aggression? And I think the answer to this is not by responding in kind, but if you like, by deflecting aggression in some way to try and create a new kind of harmony that comes from this. And I think this philosophy underlies a lot of East Asian martial arts as well. and Taoism also is connected to martial arts, where you try and use the strength of your opponent against them. And so I think one of the things that Taoists thought about was in responding to aggression, can we respond in a smart way, right? Maybe there's a way to deflect or divert the aggressiveness of your opponent in a way that doesn't produce direct conflict, but produces a sort of optimal outcome from this situation. So this is, I think, is a very counterintuitive sort of idea. I think often we're sort of primed as human beings to respond aggressively to other people's aggression. And I think this was something that the Taoists thought almost never ever works as a strategy. And so I think philosophers became the forerunners of what we might think about as sort of strategic thinking, not thinking about what's the next step, but what's the step after the next step after the next step. And I think if you can put a conflict or an aggressive action into a bigger context, I think this will help you to respond to it in a more sort of intelligent way. And ultimately, I think Taoists think that our own flourishing as individuals can only take place in the context of the flourishing of the community as a whole, right? We're not isolated individuals. We depend on others, and our own success, our own flourishing can't ever be achieved at the expense of other people. It's never a zero sum game, right?
So, James, tell me, how did Taoism evolve over time, over the ages, and why has it found fewer followers than there was in ancient China?
It's gone through many transformations. So Taoism began, I would say, as a kind of philosophy, perhaps tied to a meditation system as well. It became institutionalized as a religion in China, and there are still temples and monks and priests that you can find in China, and because of globalization, you can find them in all across the world as well. But it's quite small, and so I think one reason is that when Buddhism came to China, gradually Buddhism became the sort of dominant religion in China, and especially more recently, I mean, in the last dynasty of China, the Qing dynasty, very much favored relations with Tibet and Mongolia, and these were all very strongly Buddhist countries, so they very much favored Buddhism as a religion. But this wasn't always the case in Chinese history, and I think today Taoism became something that was very interesting to Western philosophers as well, and has become, and in the 20th century became so I think maybe people might be familiar with other kinds of concepts related or books related to Taoism, like the Tao Te Ching or the I Ching. These became very popular in the West and became emblematic of a certain kind of Eastern thinking or a kind of Eastern spirituality that seemed to be quite radically different from modern Western individualism, and had quite an impact on counterculture in the 1960s, the development of the New Age. I think these are all inspired by these philosophies and spiritualities coming from different parts of Asia to the West in the 1960s and 70s. So I think Taoism very much is alive. It's just has gone through many transformations over its history.
There's a famous story of a Chinese philosopher, Zhuangzi, who dreamt that he had turned into a butterfly. But when he woke up, he wasn't sure if he was a man who had dreamt of turning into a butterfly or he was a butterfly that had dreamt of turning into a man. So the question is, what is reality and what is illusion? And how can we use this philosophy to navigate the uncertainties of life today?
So this is one of the most famous stories in the book called Zhuangzi, which is simply the name of this Taoist philosopher. I think of this story as quite a sort of philosophical story, which is really about how do we know that things are the way that they seem to be to us, right? And I think one of the things that this calls attention to is, as human beings, we have different states of consciousness of the world, right? So we can be asleep, we can be dreaming, we can be waking, we can be aware of things, we can be focused on something, we can be concentrated on something, and maybe even we can be so in the moment concentrated on something that we enter into a kind of different psychological state. Psychologists sometimes call this a flow state, where you're so focused on and that you just sort of forget everything around you, and you're in this moment. So one of the things I think this calls attention to is our awareness of the world isn't not just on or off, right? there are different states of awareness. And the second thing is to say that things are always changing. If we think about butterflies, right? I mean, which have these 4 stages of life, from eggs, larvae, and pupas, and chrysalises, these kinds of things. Things are, and so when we look at the world, we think, oh, it's like this, but it's not, right? I mean, it's like this now, right? But I think Taoists always want to pay attention to it became like this, and it will become something else. And so we may get fixed on, oh, what is this problem that I'm dealing with right now? What is this thing that has got my attention here and now in this moment? And this causes us to forget that this came into our attention and will go out of our attention. But as human beings, we get so fixated, on the thing that's right in front of us right now. We sometimes forget that this is not the total picture, right? So I think if ever you get fixated on some, on something that's really, working away at your mind, maybe it's helpful just to sort of take a step back and say, this came into being, and it will go away. So I think that maybe is one way to think about this in terms of our sort of stressed, pressured modern lives.
That's actually very, very useful advice, to embrace change and to realize that things are temporary and that they're always changing. The other thing that was really interesting about Taoism was how they use humor in their stories and their anecdotes. And it also shows you that they're trying to embrace joy in life.
So it's true that I think many Taoist texts have been noted for their humor. It's not as though they're full of jokes that people tell, but I think there's 2 things. One is the stories sometimes are light-hearted, right? And I think that there is a point to this, which is everything can seem so serious, right? But that's not everything, right? We as human beings, we should still be able to find a light-hearted side to something, and often it seems impossible. But also, I think the Taoists were quite they made fun of people who they thought were a bit pompous, in the sense of taking things too seriously all the time. And usually the target, for for this sort of exaggerated satire or humor is Confucius, who who Zhuangzi views as this person who's like very, very well-minded, always trying to intervene in things to make the world better. And he'll go and tell people, oh, why are you doing something like this? You should be a better person. Try and improve yourself. This will be better for society. And then whatever it is that he does fails. And I think what Zhuangzi is saying is the world doesn't always work like that. No matter how good your intentions are, or no matter how you want to, you don't make somebody a better person by telling them you must be a better person. And so I think we have to be a bit careful about trying to impose our own moral vision on other people. I think this is perhaps one of the messages of this story. we have to be a little bit deferential to other people and other people's situations. And maybe humor is a way to resolve the tensions that come from the fact that I see the world in this way and you see the world in another way.
Also, the book Tao Te Ching, which you'd mentioned earlier, it uses a lot of paradoxical wisdom. So they will talk about softness over hardness, or Wu Wei as action through inaction. Why do they do that? What is the learning there?
The Tao Te Ching is a very short book of 81 chapters. They're like very sort of pithy aphorisms, like short statements that seem a little bit weird or paradoxical. And a paradox is something that on the surface appears to be self-contradictory, but what it's trying to do is point to a deeper meaning that resolves the conflict. So I think perhaps the most famous paradox in the Tao Te Ching is do nothing, and there is nothing that will not be done. Right. So on the face of it, this is nonsense, right? It's self-contradictory. But I think what it's calling into account is maybe in certain situations, there's a context in which non-action or non-aggressive action or non-intentional action produces a better outcome. And just to give you an example of this, I think there was a famous study done of in football goalkeepers who are trying to save penalties, right? So if you're a goalkeeper and you're trying to save a penalty in a soccer match and the opponent kicks the ball at you, what do you want to do? You feel compelled to act. You have to try and guess, is the ball going to go to the right or is it going to go to the left? And you have to jump in one direction and not the other. Statistically, the best thing to do is to stay in the middle of the goal and not move at all. But nobody does that because you look a bit silly. If the goalkeeper just sort of stood in the middle of the net, he would look very silly. But actually, statistically, most of the balls go towards the center of the net. And if you want to stop the ball, but people feel compelled to act sometimes, right? That's a kind of a case where acting, doing something for the sake of appearing to do something is actually less effective than not doing something. So sometimes we have to be delicate. The Tao Te Ching says governing a kingdom is like boiling a small fish. That's to say it's a task that seems to be very enormous, how to govern a kingdom. But it's actually something that has to be done with great finesse. So I think there are many sort of small paradoxes in the Tao Te Ching that are designed to call our attention to maybe the obvious way of acting or doing something in the world. And one way to think about Taoism as a whole is really it's just a philosophy of action. There are things happening in the world, we happen in the world, we intervene in the world, and we have to act in a kind of a smooth way to produce this sort of optimal outcome for everybody. Also,
they talk about Zuran, the naturalness or being your authentic self.
So Zuran, it's usually translated as natural or being so. Perhaps there's another way to translate this. This is, we could say, it's a kind of a core value in Taoism. It describes how we should be in the world. And it's certainly similar to the idea of being authentic, but I think it's a little bit different. So often, if we have the idea of authentic, you might say, oh, that was the most authentic Thai restaurant that I went to, yesterday, right? And so what does this mean? It means you have in your mind an image of what the most authentic Thai cuisine is, right? And that this restaurant that you went to conformed to this ideal picture that you have in your mind, right? In kind of modern West, we have this idea of people should be authentic or they should express their own true identity or something like this. So being authentic in that sense is conforming to some kind of ideal that you have about how things properly ought to be. And I think Zuran's a little bit different. So what Zuran means is things have their own internally driven tendencies to change. So the Zuran of an acorn is that it will become an oak tree. That's its Zuran. It's following its own nature. And
order.
so the authentic acorn doesn't stay an acorn forever, right? It grows into something else. And so I think what the Taoists want is for us to respect this internal dynamic that everything has, and that we have as individuals as well.
Tell me, what is their guidance on leadership?
So the Tao Te Ching contains many verses and chapters that seem to be aimed at giving advice to a ruler. And I think this was in ancient China, we could think about this in terms of what are the best politics or policies, or how should the ruler be. But I think we can translate this into a modern context. Because I think we can talk about leaders and teams and all of these kinds of things. So the most effective leader is one who gets his team to do whatever it is that they need to do without forcing them to do it. We should motivate people not by external punishments or carrots and sticks, right? That's a common thing. Like, if you don't do this task, we're going to, we'll demote you. Or if you do this task, we will put you in line for promotion. This is about providing external rewards for people. But I think the Taoist said the best way of leading people is so that they do the thing that you're wanting them to do without even realizing that they're doing it because they're motivated by some external reward. That is, they internalize for themselves the thing that it is that you're trying to do. So this is about appealing to people's internal motivations or dynamics. I think if people in your team think that their own, that they're doing this for their own interest and also for the team as a whole, and not because there's a big boss with a big stick telling them to do this, this is going to be more effective in the long run. So the most effective leader actually is the one who doesn't even seem to be leading, right? It's not somebody who's standing up in front wearing a suit and tie and saying, look at me, I'm the leader, right? It's about being quietly effective.
You wrote this book, Taoism and Ecology Within a Cosmic Landscape. And you talk a lot about the Taoist practices for ecological balance. So tell me, when we're faced with so much challenge today, we're faced with, so much environmental challenge, how would you advise we tackle that based on Taoist philosophy?
That's a huge issue, and I think the first thing I would say is that it's definitely true that if we look in the history of what Taoists have done in ancient China, we can see that they definitely cared about their environment, and so the maintenance of their living environment, caring for the trees and marshlands and things like this, was something that they considered to be definitely important for their communities. So I think, and I think this points to the fact that perhaps China has been going through, or people in China paid attention to environmental degradation for many hundreds of years, and this has been happening in different ways in China for a long time. But Taoists certainly paid attention to this, and their motivating concern was that if something bad is happening in the environment, this is not good for me. This will not produce a flourishing human community if we don't also have a flourishing environment, right? So human communities can't exist completely isolated from a flourishing environment. That seems to be the underlying rationale of this. And I think this is something that is lacking, I would say, in a kind of debates about environment today. So some people say, oh, we should save the planet, or save the whales, or whatever it is. And of course, we should be concerned about those things in the natural environment. But why? Right? So the Taoists are very clear about this. It's the flourishing of the world around us is necessary for us as human beings to have a flourishing life as well. So I think what the Taoists would say is don't think about the environment as this thing that's outside you, right?
Mm.
It's also inside you.
That is such a lovely note to end it on, that we are nature, we're not separate. Before I leave you today, I want you to think about this visual. There's a stream going through a forest, and there's rocks on the way, and it just goes around the rocks. It doesn't push them. It's not aggressive with conflict. It just maneuvers around the rocks. And over time, even the edges of the rocks get soothed. That is Taoism. Thank you, James. That was absolutely spectacular. I've really enjoyed the chat. Thank you for your time and for adjusting your time from China to be here with us today.
Thank you so much, very much. I enjoyed it very much.
I hope you enjoyed our first episode for Ancient Wisdom for Modern Living. In 2 weeks' time, we're going to talk to you about Zen practices for daily living. Please do join us for that. In that, we will talk about presence, mindfulness, and how that can help you manage stress and live more fulfilling lives. Thank you.